According to what Paul says in Galatians 1:10, am I a servant of Christ or am I a servant of men? If I were trying to please men, then I would not be a servant of Christ. It really doesn't matter what the world thinks of us in the way that we view our gathering. They've never liked the way we gathered before there was a pandemic. So why are we suddenly concerned about what the world thinks about our gathering when there is a pandemic? You know, as you go from Romans 12 into Romans 13, that's when you have the section that talks about the submission to governing authorities. And those two chapters, they go right back to back with one another. Sometimes we'll make these distinctions, these delineations between chapters because we've got the number markers in there. But you got to remember that as Paul is writing this letter to the church in Rome, there wasn't chapter and verse. It's just one whole letter, and that's being read before the people who are gathered there. Again, they're an assembly of people, and they're being persecuted by the Romans. They're hated by the Romans. At one point, Emperor Claudius had even expelled all the Jews, and he thought he was getting rid of all the Christians when he did that, but he targeted the wrong group of people. And so the Romans hate the Christians. They're being persecuted because they're worshiping another king other than Caesar. And so it doesn't matter to the Romans what the world thinks of them. Therefore, it should not be any concern of ours either. So as you have, beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. So the persecution that's coming by the Romans against these Christians would mean that even some of these Christians are being put to death. And yet Paul is saying, don't avenge yourselves. For vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink, for by so doing you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And if we shrink back and we don't gather as the church because we're afraid of what the world is going to think of us, we've been overcome by evil instead of overcoming evil with good. As you go on in Romans 13, where Paul talks about the avenger of God, talk about the government institutions. So it says that whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who will resist will incur judgment. Well, there's some Christians that will say, if you're gathering together as a church, you're resisting the governing authorities, which Paul said not to resist. Well, go on, keep going here. Verse 3, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. This goes back to the first question that you had asked, Armand, where you were saying, should we expect our rulers to live righteously? Well, we should expect everybody to understand that there is a standard that has been given, and that standard is of God. And if a person does not have the righteousness of Christ, then they're going to be judged against that standard. So as even our leaders are going to be held to that standard. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. Verse 4, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. What's the context here? Remember back to Romans 12, where it was said, do not avenge yourselves. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. If there is one who comes against you and persecutes you, well, God has established the governing authorities to punish the one who does wrong. He is God's servant for your good. If you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. That's the context. Romans 13 is not in any way saying to us, if your government tells you not to go to church, then you shouldn't be going to church. It's saying that God has established governing authorities to fulfill his purposes of justice, and they are expected to live according to the same standard of righteousness that everybody is. And that is a righteousness that has been established by God, not what every governing institution decides is right for their people according to their standards.